Welcome to session 52 of the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. This is a now online series. Originally it was face-to-face, in which we're looking at classic and contemporary speculative fiction, which could be fantasy, in this case, is what we're looking at, horror, sci-fi, alternate history, pick whatever you want within that spectrum. And for the last two sessions, we have been looking at the first two books in this trilogy by R. Scott Bakker, the Prince of Nothing Trilogy, which is followed by four other books in the same series in the Second Apocalypse. We are now going to be discussing the final and shorter work, the Thousandfold Thought, which is quite excellent, although not everybody else necessarily agrees, as we're going to talk about. And so we've had two previous sessions. If you're really interested in this series, you might want to go back to session 50 on the darkness that comes before, and session 51 on the warrior prophet. So in this session, we're going to be looking just at this work, although I will say that there are some points in this that I'm going to bring out in just a few minutes where the rest of the series is, in some respect, prefigured. You know, Bakker is either writing something that then he takes up as a thread, or he's already got in mind some of the, I won't even call them plot points, I'll say plot arcs and massive, important foundational ideas running through the Unholy Consult series that's going, or the Great Ordeal rather, series that's going to come after this. Now, the Thousandfold Thought, we're going to talk about Bakker's own discussions of it and some reviews in lieu of doing any biographical stuff, because we've already done that earlier in session 50. The book itself deserves a little bit of talking about just in terms of what's in it. So, like the previous one, there's a long... So this is 33 pages of what has come before, some nice summary to help you out with, you know, what's going on. And then this book is a little bit different. It's a bit shorter. Now, shorter is a relative term, right? Compare it to these two heavy tomes, which weigh in at, we got 580 odd pages, and in this case, 600 pages, right? And the 500 pages in this book seems a little bit less. I should also point out that there is an encyclopedic glossary in this work as well, which begins on page 405. So you're really only getting 400 pages of discussion, plot, dialogue, you know, denouements, revelations, and all that. But it's still 400 pages, so that's quite a lot compared to many fantasy novels. It's only short in comparison to the longer tomes that we had as part 1 and part 2. And that actually becomes a bone of contention among some readers. I do want to point out that this glossary is quite cool. And if you go on to websites where the terminology and characters and ideas and lands and religions and types of magic, pick whatever you want, from this series is being talked about, it's really coming from this encyclopedic glossary, and this is well worth reading just in its own right, because there's almost like a story that's being told through it. There's actually an author's note too, and he says, steeped in the classics, Inrithi scholars commonly rendered names in their Sheikh form. He goes on with that, and then he also tells us the vast majority of these proper names are simply transliterated, and what's really cool is it concludes this little author's note by saying, these would be the names as Drusus Akamian knew them. And I kind of like that. Why? Because Akamian is a central character, right? As is Esamet, as is Canair, as is Kelhus. But in a way, although Kelhus is really the character around whom everything ultimately ends up revolving, Akamian really is the most central character, I would argue. And we're seeing much of this, if we're seeing it through anybody's eyes, we're really seeing it, I would say, through Akamian. And although maybe supplemented by Canair and Asimov. So that's probably enough about the book itself. Let's talk about, before we look at the reviews, let's talk about some of the prefigurations or foreshadowings of the 4 books yet to come that we find contained in this book if we know to look for it. And before we do that, what I'm going to say is this has actually been my 3rd time reading this book. The very first time reading it, you're wandering through it and maybe picking up on half of what's going on. The second time you see a lot more, especially since you already know where the book is going. The third time you grasp a lot more than you did in the past. So let's talk about these foreshadowings. The Great Ordeal is a set of 4 additional volumes in this Second Apocalypse series that are written after the Thousandfold Thought and which are happening starting 20 years afterwards, right? And so there's a lot going on in those. I count 4 different places in the Thousandfold Thought where there are, you could call them forward references to, or foreshadowings, whatever you want to call them, premonitions of what is going to be happening in the Great Ordeal, which is oriented around Kelhus, now the aspect emperor of the 3 seas, taking a rather triumphant and more or less unified, although there's a lot of fissures and cracks, humanity, and leading this massive army and, sorcery, you could call it reconstituted schools thing, north to Golgotharoth to try to destroy the consult before they can reawaken the no-god. And so there's 4 places in here where what's going to happen is, I think, being foreshadowed. And I could be wrong. Maybe there's more. Maybe these are just sort of like Bakker himself didn't build these in and just kind of picked up on them later on. He's like, oh, this is a good idea. I kind of look at it as not quite prophecy. And here we actually see prefigured, this interesting discussion that happened even in the first book about the notion that Kelhus has, which he got from his the people who've raised him, that there's this causal connection, and what goes before determines what comes afterward. That prophecy can't happen, and Kelhus comes to realize that that's not actually the case, at least within the narrative universe. So that's enough back and forth about this and metaphysical speculation. What are these 4 points? So one is very early on, and this is coming through the eyes of Canair, who really is one of the people who knows Kelhus the best. The Skilvendi, who's traveled with him, who had a previous encounter with Kelhus' father, Mangus, right? So he says, Canair found himself looking about the chamber, his breath tight in his chest, quietly astounded that men wept rather than jeered. And then, for the first time, the depths of the dread purpose that moved these men became palpable. He had seen it. He had witnessed it on the fields beyond Coruscant's wall, the lunatic determination, enough to shame even his Utamat. He had watched men vomit boiled grass as they stumbled forward. He'd seen others who could scarce walk throw themselves on the weapons of the heathen just to disarm them. He had seen men smile, cry out in joy as the mastodons descended upon them. He could remember thinking that these men, these Inrithi, were the true people of war. Now, that's a huge thing, of course, because the Skilvendi are the people of war, right? And so he says, Canair had seen it, but he had not understood, not fully. What the Dunyain had wrought here would never be undone. Even if the Holy War should perish, the word of these events would survive. ink would make this madness immortal. Calhus had given these men more than gestures or promises, more even than insight or direction. He had given them dominion over their doubts, over their most hated foes. He had made them strong. But how could lies do such a thing? The world these men dwelt within was a fever dream, a delusion, and yet it seemed as real to them, Canair knew, as his world seemed to them. The only difference, and Canair was curiously troubled by the thought, was that he could, in meticulous detail, track the origins of their world within his, and only then because he knew the Dunyain. Of all that congregated in this room, he alone knew the ground, the treacherous footing beneath their foot. So this is, telling us about what's happening in this story, and actually what's happened in the two previous books, where Calhus has managed to forge a movement out of the raw material of the Holy War, Inrithism, the notion of prophecy, and appealing to the needs, the desires, the demands, the psychological depths of the people who he's working with, right? Something greater is going to come out of this. There's another passage a little bit later where Canair has been assigned to this task of watching over the disarmed Nonser and Confus, right? And he says he understood why Calhus wanted Confus dead. The Dunyain suffered no rivals. Likewise, he understood why Calhus had chosen him as his assassin. Of course the savage had killed the lion. Was he not Skilvendi? Was he not a survivor of Ciuth? So these are talking about things that went before. Battle of Ciuth, which happens in the very first book early on, is where the Skilvendi are broken as a people. Canair is one of the few Skilvendi chieftains who actually survives. And this is what allows Confus to become not just exalt general of the Nonser, the empire, but the possibility of the leader becoming the leader, as he doesn't end up becoming, of the Holy War. And so there's this rivalry going on there, right? It would be natural for Calhus to appoint Canair to be his tool. But then Canair says, here's in his thought, what tormented him was what these understandings implied. If murdering Mangus, his father, was Calhus' sole mission, then preserving the Holy War should be his sole concern. Why assassinate Confus when he need only remove him from the game, as he had? And why use Canair to conceal his involvement when the consequences, open war with the Empire, would have no bearing on the imminent conquest of Chimay, this holy city that the entire Holy War has been oriented towards taking? And then Canair realized there was no way around it. The Dunyain was looking beyond the Holy War, past Chimay. And to see past Chimay was also to see past Mangus. So, this is very important as well. The story began in the first book with Mangus summoning his son Calhus to come get him, and then there's all this traveling that takes place, and Calhus falls in with Canair, who knows that he's a Dunyain, and they travel, and then they become both of them involved in the Holy War. The Prince of Nothing rises to become the warrior prophet, and Canair for a long time is the war leader for that. He even draws men who imitate him. They abandon their own folk ways and try to become Skilvendi, which he thinks is kind of interesting. And all of this is oriented, according to Calhus, to get down to Chimay, where his dad is, and to assassinate his dad, which both he and Canair want to do. Maybe they have to compete over who's going to get to do it. Here, Canair says, aha, this is not really about killing Dad. This is, or even rejoining Dad. This is about something going beyond this. And that is going to be the great ordeal, as we're going to find out. Another really important, interesting prefiguration that I won't tell you that much about, as I have with these others, happens in the dreams of Akamian, where he is recounting what happened in the first apocalypse. And this begins with one of his things, with now Coyote at his side, Akamian crouched in the darkness, peering across the yawning fall before them. For days they'd groped through the black, too terrified to dare any light. At times it seemed they climbed through blackened lungs, so choked and multitudinous were the tunnels. Their elbows bled from crawling on their bellies. He's talking about the dreams of Seswatha that all of the Mandate sorcerers relive at night. During the years of the Great Investiture, these Shrank had burrowed out from Golgotharoth, far beneath the armies camped across the surrounding plains. When the siege was broken, the consul had forgotten the mines, thinking themselves invincible, and why would they not? So here's where we get to the prefiguring. The ordeal. The holy war, called by Anasurambor Kelamas against Golgotharoth, had dissolved. Had dissolved in what? Acrimony and cannibal pride. And the unholy advent was near, so very near. Now, those words, cannibal pride, that's going to be kind of important, but I'm not going to tell you exactly why, except that it has to do with the second great ordeal. And the Shrank will play an important role in that as well. Now, the final one is happening towards the very end of the book, near the, they've actually finished with a whole bunch of plot points and things like that. And this is when Calhus and Mangus are talking to each other. And here we go. This is a very interesting point. So Calhus says, the crimes you've committed, Father, the sins, when you learn of the damnation that awaits you, when you come to believe, you will be no different than the Inkaroi. As Dunyain, you will be compelled to master the consequences of your wickedness. Like the consult, you will come to see tyranny in what is holy, and you will war as they war. So this is Calhus talking to somebody who is Dunyain, who is his father, who has managed to become somebody warring against the consult, but he's saying you will be in the same boat as the consult. Calhus fell back into himself, opened his deeper soul to the details of his father's nearly naked form, the strength of limbs, the speed of reflex. And then he says, to shut the world against the outside, to seal it through the extermination of mankind. This is his father talking. And then Calhus replies, as Ishual is shut against the wilderness. For the Dunyain, it was axiomatic. What was compliant had to be isolated from what was unruly and intractable. Calhus had seen it many times, wandering the labyrinth of possibilities that was the thousandfold thought. Right? The rise of Anasurambor Mangus to take his place, the apocalyptic conspiracies, the counterfeit war against Golgotharoth, the accumulation of premeditated disasters, sacrifice of whole nations to the gluttony of the Shrank, the three seas crashing into char and ruin. And so he can see what his father would do, or what the Dunyain themselves would do, and he's going to do something different. But if you read the 4 books yet to come, you'll see that this passage is actually prefiguring what's going to happen to the Dunyain themselves in relation to the consult. So these are some pretty important, you could say, foreshadowings, whatever you want to call them. They're also going to play an important role within this text itself. I would like to spend a bit of time, perhaps not as much as I did in the previous sessions, talking about some reviews of the Thousandfold Thought, and not just reading them, but noting what's important in them and what some of the reviewers might have missed. And then I want to talk a bit about what R. Scott Bakker, in one interview, has to say about the Thousandfold Thought and some of his, writing processes and reflections on his own work. So the first review is in SSF SFF 180, and it's by Thomas Wagner. And these reviews are all near in time to the release of the Thousandfold Thought, right? He says, in the Thousandfold Thought, R. Scott Bakker comes so close to being crushed under the weight of his literary ambitions, you almost jump for joy to see him emerge at the end of it relatively unscathed. He's dared a really great deal in constructing this trilogy, and he's broken virtually every rule fantasy fans have come to expect. These are on general principle good things. Some of Bakker's choices have amounted to biting off more than he can chew, but so what? His willingness to do it is admirable enough that when all of the smoke from this book's breathless chapters is cleared, you'll be happy to give the guy a big hand. Now, do I buy into that? I think that's a little bit overblown, perhaps. I think Bakker is a bit more, competent in handling these things. Then he goes on and he says, Bakker's choice to tackle such weighty themes does sometimes make his book slow-moving, difficult, expository. It's fair to say that not a lot actually happens in much of this final volume, which can seem kind of a letdown considering we've been plowing through 1,000 pages waiting for this massive holy war to reach its gory and apocalyptic climax. Bakker lets the first half of this book take its sweet time. We get some pompous speechifying. The motivations and desire lines of his characters often lack focus or apparent sense. But when Bakker pulls out the stops in the last 100 pages, the resulting flash flood of action is spectacular enough to offset the mildly disappointing fact that the resolution of Kelhus's primary goal, the meeting with his father Mangus and the culmination of the saga's themes, is played out mostly through dialogue. Bakker intercuts their scenes with gloriously chaotic moments of battle that often play out like a Hieronymus Bosch painting come to hellish life. It makes for one of the most freakishly unput-downable conclusions to a fantasy trilogy I've read in a long time. So I think that's partly right, and I think that's partly mistaken. And I'm not going to say partly wrong, but I will say partly mistaken, because I think that the reviewer, in this case, It's the sort of thing I might have said on a first read of this, but not after rereading it. So there's something to actually spending time with it that helps you to fill in the gaps. I don't buy that very little is happening in the first half of it. Very little is happening if we're primarily focused on the proceeding of the Holy War. If we're also interested in what's happening in the minds of these characters, particularly Asimov, Akamian, and Canair, there's a lot that's happening. And actually, we're learning a lot about the consult as well in this volume, perhaps more than we did in either of the previous two, through what's actually going on. And there's some important jockeyings and some, people getting, elevated, brought down. Think about the Scarlet Spires and their Grand Master realizing, holy crap, these prophecies are actually true. We're not at the center of things. We're actually kind of a side note. And then he's getting his school ready to fight against the Cicerum towards the very end. So I don't think that this is actually right, except I will say that there is, as they're catapulting into the final action, there is a lot going on. Speechifying, philosophizing, that's important for this, right? Let's go on to the next one. This is from James Davies in Fantasy Faction. It is not a bad book, more a novel that I'm not sure Bakker knew what to do with. It seems to be part apocalyptic showdown, part setup for the next trilogy, giving it a very cloudy identity as to what on earth it's trying to get across. Obviously, Bakker originally envisioned it as the climax of his first novel. In that sense, it might have worked very well, but as its own novel, it suffers quite considerably, I feel. Let's talk about that climax. This is about the last quarter of the book, with the exception of the very last 10 or so pages. Bakker, unfortunately, seems to have thought that to have exciting pacing, he would have to flit between 5 different plot threads at the rate of a beam of light caught between 5 reflections. Nice prose there, isn't it? Probably a page is spent with one character before you're thrust to another, then again, and then again. This must go on for at least 50 pages, if not more, and it truly gets to the point where you lose focus on what is going on completely. This is definitely the case for one such thread, which revolves around deep philosophical debate between 2 powerful characters. And there he's talking about, the 2 Dunyain, right? Calhus and his father Mangus. Flitting in and out of this conversation so much caused me to completely lose track of the flow of the conversation, and I feel its true meaning was lost on me. This was a damn shame. Bakker's flow of writing is quality as usual, but his choice to sacrifice that quality for pacing was wrong. Now, again, this is one of those things where I would be more inclined to go along with it if two things were not the case. If I was not reading this for the second and third time, and if I didn't understand why the philosophy stuff mattered. I think that it might be hard for some readers to get as easy a grasp, because Bakker really is a philosophical writer, on what's happening in some of these dialogues with the characters, particularly when it gets really metaphysical, right? As it does between the two Dunyain in this. I think it might be a little bit harder to follow. I think that could be a fair charge, but there's so much exposition given, and the glossary, I think, would help somebody. Now, some people pointed out that why do you have to go to a glossary? Well, you can say the same thing, though, about Martin or Tolkien, right? Davies goes on and he says, the slower character moments in the stories of Acamian, Esimet, Calhus, and Canair, which were always the best parts of these novels, continue to shine with some intensely moving moments in the story. The last scene in particular is marvelous and potentially one of the best closings of a novel I've come across. The stage set is grand in its potential consequences, and the character development painfully inevitable, but wonderfully portrayed. It's a wonderful setup for the next trilogy, if a somewhat lackluster ending for the current one. The reason I write this is purely due to the number of plot lines still left wide open at the end of this book, with barely a story concluded satisfactorily. So there's really two things going on in this discussion, right? One is, he's right. Bakker is leaving all sorts of plot lines open so that he can explore them in the books to come. That's completely true. And if that's something that makes this novel not as good, well, so be it. I do think that he's really onto something, though, in saying the slower character moments continue to shine with intensely moving moments in the story. So this guy gets what Wagner was not getting. The last one, Rob Bedford, in SFF World. In the Thousandfold Thought, we see Calhus more through the eyes of his supporting cast. This really allows the reader to feel the awe, reverence, and fear these people feel for the warrior prophet as he leads his holy war across the landscape of the three seas. The primary characters remain the same: Esimet, Drusus Acamian, and Canair. There are many more older characters, plus one or two new characters featured prominently in this volume. Each of these characters sees Calhus in their own light, but each light is a different reflection of awe in which they hold the warrior prophet. I think that's quite true. That's a great insight into what's going on here. Now, he goes on and he says, while Calhus may be a center around which these characters orbit, by no means is he the only character with such a powerful effect on the other characters. Take the former lovers, Esimet and Akka. They loved each other and still do, but they do not understand the depths of each other's emotions until they were apart, particularly when Esimet realizes how Akka felt about her. And I think that's very insightful as well. He goes on and he says, one thing that really struck me, regardless of whether or not the scene was straightforward action, dialogue between characters, or internal dialogue of discovery, Bakker's narrative pull was equally strong. Many of the tightly crafted and addictive scenes involved one character and their internal dialogue. Esimet re-examines her life through the majority of the novel. That's very true, especially now that she's able to read. That opens an entire world, right? In the previous volumes, Akka struggled with the realization of the prophecies long considered coming to light and his ultimate role as advisor to the man at the center of the prophecy. Through this re-examination, Esimet grows to know her former lover, providing for some of the more poignant and powerful scenes, not just in this particular novel, but in any of the fantasy novels I've come across. And really, I would say that leads to the final conclusion with the scene where Akka repudiates all of these things. I think without the Esimet scene in there. There's no actual repudiation that takes place. And Bedford goes on to say, indeed, this entire trilogy deals with inner reflection perhaps more so than any of the contemporaries on the shelves. I don't know if that's the case, but it certainly does a lot. Consideration of one's inner self and outer self only touch the tip of the iceberg of the many thoughtful considerations the warrior prophet drives the characters and in turn the reader to consider, right? So that's actually a really great set of insights. I think that there's other reviews out there that you can check out, but those are probably the best ones that I came across. With a living author and one who has been so online until fairly recently for so much of the progress of the stories coming out, I'd be very remiss to not actually bring Bakker into the mix with at least one interview. And so this is one from SFF World, right? And some of these questions are really quite interesting, especially the responses to them. So he was asked, given the complexity of many of your characterizations, is there a character you particularly enjoyed or enjoyed writing? Why is that? Is there also a character you absolutely don't like writing about? And Bakker says, there's no one I really dislike writing. It's more a matter of each posing their peculiar challenges at particular points. Now, I really like that because what he's doing is taking a binary, like, don't like, and turning it into a more contextual thing. Each of them has their challenges because each of them is not a living being, but at least something coming out of my head that I need to work with. And he says, Calhus is typically the most difficult because it's hard to convincingly portray someone that damn smart. Others, like Canair, oscillate between extreme difficulty and writing themselves. I had expected he would be the most difficult after Calhus to write in the Thousandfold Thought, but thanks to the Melvins and Lustmord, he ended up writing himself, right? The bands, right? Confus is easily my favorite. Now, isn't that a funny thing to say? And we've talked about this in previous sessions where Bakker has talked about why he liked writing Confus. He says, sometimes I laugh my ass off writing his sections. And Confus is this character who's kind of full of himself, but has some reasons to be full of himself and is kind of a, weird guy, but also attractive in many respects. A little bit later, he's asked, what do you feel is your strength as a writer or storyteller? And Bakker says, this question is hard because I still feel I have so much to learn. I think my strength is that I set myself explicit challenges for myself, extreme challenges in some case. For each scene, I always ask myself what I want my words to do. Most times I fall short of my goals, sometimes I satisfy them, and every once in a while, like the scene I call Asimov's song in the Thousandfold Thought, I sit back and think, there's no way I wrote that. Now, that's also some very interesting reflections there, I think, from the author. He was asked again, what would you say was the hardest part of the entire process involved in writing The Prince of Nothing? Each new edition reveals yet more depth to a series, which has shown just how rich and complex it truly is. What was the spark that generated the idea which drove you to write the series in the first place? And so here Bakker talks at greater length. He says, I could go on and on about the complexities. I just spent so much time layering things into the world and story, it almost feels geological when I think about it. The framework arose from my attempt to make good on all the work I put into my D&D campaigns back in the 80s. The story proper grew around the character of Calhus, who arose from the biggest revelation I suffered in my first year of university back in 1986, the realization that belief systems are more a product of social function than of truth. So here's where it gets really interesting. Standing inside a given belief system, canonical claims always seem obviously true, so much so that we reflexively use them as the yardstick of other belief systems, while remaining utterly oblivious to the fact that others are doing the exact same thing with the same depth of conviction. We seem to forget that having conviction, no matter how soulful or meaningful or redemptive, is as much an indicator of deception as it is of accuracy. Ignorance is invisible, after all. thanks to psychological mechanisms like confirmation bias, fundamental attribution error, and self-exceptionalism, we're quite content with the embarrassing notion that we somehow just lucked onto the one true belief system. And why not, when it's the only yardstick that we have? Everything else has to come up short. Outsiders are judged and found wanting. When you consider the pivotal role belief plays in action and the way social systems depend on the repetition of interrelated actions to exist, he says, then you can see that the primary function of belief systems is to conserve actions, not to be true. This is why social systems collapse when belief in them collapses, which is arguably what happened in the old Soviet Union. Given things like this, I asked myself what a martial artist who used the functionality of belief as well as his swords and his hands would look like, and I came up with Kalhus. And I think that's part of the story there, right? Because the other thing that Bakker is doing is entering, not just creating Kalhus, which is an interesting project in its own right, and a serious challenge, right? Because all the things we've talked about already. But again, those three other really absolutely central characters through whom we have so much exposition and there's so much development, Akamian, Esimet, Canair, each of them is also living within belief systems, but also skeptical about those belief systems and trying to make sense of themselves. There's a lot of reflection going on. Maybe more reflection on their part than there even is on Kalhus's part, even though he possesses the thousandfold thought. So that's an interesting set of ideas. And now it's time for us to actually explore some philosophical themes that will largely be centered around the action and the characters. But there's a lot of scope for exploring that in this final novel in this series. It is quite fitting that we begin with a grand theme of endings for a trilogy that is ending right here in my hand with A Thousandfold Thought, and particularly a trilogy which doesn't have an awful lot of epilogue once the final conflicts have been worked out. And there's still a number of threads, as one of the reviewers pointed out, left to be tugged, to be tied to, as is going to happen in the 4 follow-up books. But there's a lot of things that are actually coming to a nice, fairly neat close by the end of this. So we can talk in particular about Kalhus and his connection with his father, Mangus, also about Canair, and because both Kalhus and Canair have been seeking out Mangus, and there is a resolution there, a very important resolution that we're going to talk about in different ways. We can also talk about a very, very dramatic resolution for Akamian, and that's at the very end of this story, so we're going to get to that shortly. And we can talk about the end of the Holy War itself, all of these men of the Tusk and the great names and the emperor, at one time Exalt General, now Emperor, as we're going to see, betraying the Holy War. And also we can talk about Esimet and her relationship with Kalhus and the ending of her relationship with Akamian and coming into her own as well. So there's a lot of stuff getting brought to a close here, and we have to trace all of those endings out. There's other philosophical themes that we'll explore as well, but this will probably take us a little bit of time. So I want to begin with Confus, who has betrayed the Holy War, and in the narrative looks like he might actually cause the failure at Chimay, because things are so close between the Phanim and the men of the Tusk, the Inithri, the followers of Kalhus, and now the Emperor, Confus, has taken that role, is about to stab them in the back. And he says, astride his horse, the Emperor gazed down the Inithri encampment out to where Chimay smoked and flickered with warring lights. In addition to the ailing Psyche Grand Master, General, Area Monteras, several sundry officers and members of the messenger corps accompanied him, arrayed along the summit of the mounded ridge. His kidrihul, so those heavy cavalry, fanned out before him, forming ranks lower on the slopes near a series of ruined structures he couldn't be troubled to identify. His columns, the infantry, approached from behind, already drawn into red and gold battle lines. Their timing had been impeccable. They'd departed from the fleet the night before in a miraculous little harbor mere miles up the coast. Even the winds had been blessed, and now he fairly cackled at what he saw. The scarlet spires engaged in the shadow of the Judarum. Half the holy war was running heedless and amok through the smoking streets. Fanael striking to the south of the city, trying to outflank the stubborn Tidoni. Everything was exactly as his scouts had informed him. The men of the Tusk had no inkling of his arrival, which meant that Sompas, wherever he was, had succeeded in stopping the Skilvendi. 4 full columns, a veritable spear in the small of the Holy War's back. And he laughs and he says, this is going to be amazing. And then something happens. Akamian shows up. And Akamian, remember, is a sorcerer of the Mandate. He is armed with the Gnosis, which can tear apart the lesser sorcery of the anagnostic schools like the Psyche or, the Scarlet Spires for that matter. And he says, Confus found and recognized the man immediately. Drusus, Akamian walking through the grass, turning toward him, his eyes and mouth ablaze, engaging in his sorcery. Groping for his kore, he screamed, Kekemet, but heat sucked all air from his lungs. He heard screams dissolve like salt into boiling broth. He was falling. To me, Emperor, an aged voice cried. To me. He was on the ground, rolling through grasses that had become black ash. Somehow, the Grand Master of the Imperial Psyche was standing above him, his white hair whipping in convections, his sorceress voice strong, despite his unsteady stance. Ethereal ramparts distorted the air between them and the Mandate sorcerer, who'd turned to the breaking ranks of Kidrahul. Lines of light swept out, more perfect than any rule, flashing across the nearest of the Imperial heavy cavalry, who collapsed not bodily, but in sopping pieces that rolled between the hummocks and the weeds. So Akmanian is doing something that he's sort of threatened to do all of this time, which is to let loose the gnosis on these people. And what we see end up happening is he destroys the Psyche, he destroys these things, and then Akmanian is actually seized by a Sipfrang, a demon that takes him away. Here we go. And the monstrosity leapt into the sky, punishing the air with rent wings. Esimet sees this happening. And then Confus recovers. I live, Ikure Confus cried one more time, only to hear nothing above the crack and thunder of sorceress battle both near and far. No resounding cheer, no individual shouts of relief or acclaim. They couldn't see him, that was it. They mistook him for one of their own, for a man, because he believes himself to be a god. And so he brings his troops back into line, finds some horsemen, tell them to signal the general advance. Grinning, he turned back to the vista of his army, only to see the horsemen he'd glimpsed earlier, several hundred of them, riding unchallenged along the stationary flanks of the Celial column. There are no nations, there are no more nations, a voice cried. And then Confus says, kill them, attack, 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 right? So he's going to betray them one more time. And then he says, the white-clad knights abruptly changed direction, began riding towards him. Confus turned to the remaining columnaries, at once laughed and snarled. Going further down here, of the dozen Nancer columnaries who faced him, 2 fell to their knees, weeping, 3 offered their swords, 5 ran like madmen, and 2 simply walked away. He reminds them, I defeated the Skilvendi, you were there. And then they kiss his imperial ring, and then what happens after that? The Emperor of Nancer turned, not really believing. He saw King Saubun leaning from his saddle, his face ruddy with murderous intent. More than sun glinted in the man's blue eyes. He saw the broadsword that took his head. And that is the end of Contrast. That is the end of the Nonser Empire. That is the end of that. And that is the beginning of Saubun's redemption, which is going to carry through into the 4 books that follow. So there's a nice tying things up. Proyas, of course, is another very important great name that's going to be tied in with this as well. So that's one line of very important ending. We get to see the end of Canair, but not the true end of him, because he is going to continue forward as an important character in the 4 volumes yet to come. But we get to see his resolution of what he's been about, what he's been aiming for after Calhus leaves his wounded father and Mangus and Canair encounter each other. So what we see depicted here is the Skilvendi gagged for breath. There he was, slumped against the mad walls of this place in a white illuminated chamber that opened at the end of the corridor, pale, naked save a loincloth. There he was. For hours, Canair had climbed through these halls, following Cerve and her brother as they tracked Calhus's scent. Apart from the braziers beneath the cavernous waterfall, all had been black, deep, dark into dark. Through an underworld of vile images, they passed through ruins, Cerve said, the minds of the Kunaroi, long murdered by the ancestors of men, and Canair had known no track could lead him farther from the steppe. His heart had hammered in his ears. He had glimpsed his father, Sciotha, beckoning through the black, and now there he was, Mangus, the object of his revenge. So he stops Cerve and her brother, and then here we go. Throughout this, Canair had advanced down the corridor, walking steadily through the numbness of his gait, made it seem he shambled. He remembered approaching Calhus the same way the day that he'd found him half dead on his father's barrow, surrounded by circles of lifeless shrank. He remembered the limb-hollowing air of nightmares, the breath like needles, but this was different. That had been the point of departure from his homeland, from his people, from everything he had thought hallowed and strong. This was his destination. This was him, the person who had taken him off the path to begin with. And here we go. Nayu, the blind face, said in recognition. Calhus's voice, Calhus's features. When had the sun become the father's mold? Nayu, you have returned to me, just as I knew you would. So he's talking to him in this familiar diminutive term. He says, Nayu, put down your sword, please. And then he says, I am Canair or Urs Sciotha, the most violent of men. And Mangus says, no, that is but a lie that you use to conceal your weakness from other men just as weak. Canair says, it is you who lie. And then Mangus says, but I see it within you. I see the truth of you. I see your love. I hate, he screamed so loud the walls returned the words to him in 1,000 whispers. Though blind, Mangus somehow managed to look to the ground in pensive pity. So many years, so many seasons, everything I showed you has scarred your heart, set you apart from the people. Now you hold me accountable for what I taught. Why does it torment you so? Surely lies when uncovered fade like smoke. It is truth that burns, Naya, as you know, for you have burned in it for uncounted seasons. And he goes on, and Canair says, he loved him, this man who had shown him, who'd led him onto the trackless steppe. Mangus says, I am dying, Nayu, I need your strength. And Canair thinks to himself, he had loved only him in all the world. Weeping faggot. The kiss was deep, the smell strong, his heart hammered, shame bled from his every pore, skittered across his trembling limbs, and somehow ignited an even deeper ardor. What does he do? He grips him and takes out the Korah, and he says, I wander trackless ground. So he's absorbed the lessons. He's finally figured things out, and he's going to with the Korah, the tear of God that kills sorcerers, that turns them into salt. He's going to destroy, finally, the one who he's been seeking all of this time. And then Mangus gasped, jerked, and spasmed as Canair rolled the Korah across his cheek. White light flared from his gouged sockets. For an instant, Canair thought it seemed as though the god watched him through a man's skull. But then his lover fell away, burning as he must. Such was the force of what had possessed him. Is this a resolution? Well, we see. Canair says, "Not again!" He howled at the sagging form. He stumbled to his knees, weaving, raping. "How could you leave me?" And he laughed, thinking of the final swazund he would cut into his throat, killing himself, right? One last thought too many. See, he cackled with grief. He knelt over his lover's corpse for how many heartbeats he would never know. Then, just as the sorceress light began to fade, a cool hand fell on his cheek. He turned and saw Serve. For an instant, her face cracked as though gasping for air, but then it was seamless once again, seamless and perfect. Yes, Serve, the first wife of his heart, his proof and prize, absolute darkness engulfed them. And now he is ready to join the consult completely, but still as Canair, not as an agent of the consult, but somebody who aligns with him. And that's where he ends. The end and the resolution for Akamian is, in some respects, a long time coming. And there's more that we need to say about his relationship as it develops with Kelhus. At the very beginning in this chapter, Coruscant, there's this important phrase here. Akamian realized that this was year one, a new age of men. He says, while waiting for the hidden machinery of messengers and secretaries to relay his request, Akamian wandered into an adjoining courtyard, struck by the other immensities that framed his present circumstance. Even if there was no consult, no threat of the second apocalypse, he realized nothing would be the same. Kelhus would change the world, not in the way of an Agencus or a Triamus, but in the way of an Inri Sejanus. So as a prophet, as we're going to see, not just as a prophet, not just as a king, not just as a warrior, not just as a philosopher, not just as a sorcerer, not just as the shaman, right, who combines sorcerer and prophet, but as an aspect emperor, which has a very important role in this. And year one means that everything is beginning again with him. So Akamian, after he is released, is walking back and comes into the presence of the court. This is a very important scene. All were kneeling as he passed through the outer ring of pillars. Pressing through their murmuring midst, he found himself thinking of the strange hollow that had opened within him. He stood, he breathed, which meant his heart still beat within his breast, but its pulse was lost to him. He thought of all the lice that would soon spill from his scalp, right, because he's about to die. Then he recognized the voice of Mythonet, the holy Shira of the 1,000 temples. Arise, Anasurimbor, Kelhus, for all authority now resides in thee. A moment of silence. Behold the warrior prophet, the obscured Shira bellowed. Behold the high king of Kuniri. Behold the aspect emperor of the three seas. The words winded Akamian as surely as a father's blow. While the men of the tusk leapt to their feet, crying out in rapture and adulation, he staggered against one of the white pillars, feeling the cool of engraved figures pressed against his neck. What was this hollow that had so consumed him? What was the yearning that felt so like mourning? Here he's remembering the words of Canair, who knows the secret of the Dunyain. They make us love. They make us love. Some time passed before he realized Kelhus himself was speaking. Akamian found himself drawn forward, dressed in the silk collets of their enemy. Thanes and knights pressed clear of his path, staring as though he were a leper. Now here's an important speech by Kelhus. With me, Everything is rewritten. Your books, your parables, and your prayers, all that was your custom, are now nothing more than childhood curiosities. For too long has truth languished in the vulgar hearts of men. What you call tradition is naught but artifice, the fruit of your vanity, of your lust, of your fear, and your hate. With me, all souls shall find a more honest footing. With me, all the world is born anew. Year 1. Actually, let's pause on that a moment and think about what this means. We've seen this theme coming up previously, that a person could be truth incarnate rather than just a mere possessor of the truth. And the truth that is Kelhus, which behind the scenes is actually, there's a different truth, and he is revealing, he's working off of the falsehoods that humans believe in, but they think that they have now grasped the truth. This is going to remake everything. All the things that they have believed so deeply, he can transfer the power, the force, the meaning from the prophets, from the philosophers, even perhaps from sorcery itself and its relationship with the metaphysics of his world, into something that becomes available right there. And if you think about the difference between that and what Fanemry, which is kind of a prefiguration of it, the solitary God, Fanem as his prophet, was providing to people, no longer this mediated through the 1,000 temples of the many different gods, the God within all of these, rather abstract and then, particularized. Kelhus is taking that place, and he's doing it as a human being. Somebody that can be engaged with, somebody who can be loved, somebody who can be obeyed. So they're at the holy court of the aspect emperor now. He saw Mythonet draped in the golden vestments of his station. He saw Proyas, Sauban, all the other surviving lords of the Holy War, a new caste nobility, less numerous but more radiant than the old. He saw the Nescenti and other high-ranking apparati of the ministrate decked in the glory of their fraudulent station. He saw now Zera and the quorum flashing crimson gold in the mandate's finest ceremonial robes. He even saw Ioka standing as pale as glass in Eleazar's magisterial gown. So he's seeing the new nobility, he's seeing the Nescenti, all of these are the followers. He's seeing his own school of sorcery, he's seeing the other main school at this point in time, the Scarlet Spires represented. Then he sees Esimet, her mouth open, her painted eyes shining with tears that spilled, a Nilmaneshi empress once again. So this woman who began as a prostitute, a harlot in the holy city, who he loved but couldn't marry, who he found again, they loved again, then she thought him dead and became the consort of Kelhus, and there's this divide between them. He sees her. He says, he could not see Serway, he could not see Canair or Confus, neither was Ximenes anywhere to be found. All of them are dead or vacant. But he saw Kelhus sitting leonine before a great hanging circumflex of white and gold. Going on, he saw him drawing the nets of the future, measuring, theorizing, categorizing, penetrating. He saw the Dunyain. Kelhus nodded to him. This is what I decree, Akka, the old world is dead. Leaning against his staff, Akamian, so you speak of an apocalypse. And then he's told, come take your place at my side. It would be so simple for Akamian to now fit in. And he's been the vizier, he's been the teacher, the royal tutor. But he doesn't do that. He says, no, I've returned for my wife, nothing more. A moment of crushing, monolithic silence. Preposterous, Nautzerta cried out. You will do as he recommends. Even though Akamian heard the grand old sorcerer, he did not heed him. Years had passed since he last understood his scholastic brothers. He held out his hand. So he's engaging in an absolute existential gesture there. Esme. He watched her find her feet, saw the crescent of her belly. She was showing. How could he not have seen that before? Kelhus simply watched. You're a mandate schoolman, Nautsera grated with admirable menace. A mandate schoolman, trying to remind him of his responsibilities. Esme, Achmanian said, his eyes outstretched hand directed only at her. Please. This was the only thing that could mean any more for Achamian. Aka, she sobbed. She glanced around, seemed to wilt beneath the rapt gazes. I'm the mother of. And here we get to the climax, the crux, the turning point. So the hollow could not be shut. Achamian nodded, wiped the last tear he knew he would ever shed. He would be heartless now, a perfect man like the Dunyain, right? She approached him. The world, Aka, don't you see the very world hangs in the balance? With a savagery that both thrilled and frightened him, he snatched her left wrist, twisted and bent it back so she could see the blurred tattoo that blackened the back of her hand. He thrust her away from her. The crowd erupted in outrage. No, Esimet shrieked from the floor. Leave him alone, leave him. You don't know him, you don't know. And then Achamian says his renunciations. I renounce. Achamian roared. I renounce my station as holy tutor, as vizier to the court of the Anasurember Kelhus. I renounce my school, he continued, as an assembly of hypocrites and murderers. Nautsera says, then you sentence yourself to death. There's no sorcery outside the schools. I renounce my prophet. Gasps and sputters filled the galleries of the first temple. He waited for the uproar to subside, staring for what seemed an unblinking eternity at the otherworldly aspect of Anasurember Kelhus, his last student. Somehow his gaze found Proyas, who looked so aged. And he says, and I renounce my wife as an adulteress. And his face, a mask of Nimil, he turned without leave, began walking back the way he came. The men of the tusk stared at him dumbstruck, their outrage as bright as sparks in their eyes, but they fell before his approach. They fell away. Achamian, Kelhus said, the next time you come before me, you will kneel, Drusus Achamian. Then the book ends. Retracing his bloody footprints, the wizard limped on. Why is he a wizard? He has no school. He is on his own. He has gone away, and that's how the whole thing ends. Fittingly, for the person who's been so central in all of these events, Achamian, and how much of this has been told through his eyes. And now we come to another ending, longer, perhaps even you could say more momentous, that which arises out of the culmination of Kelhus's quest, which he used the Holy War to pursue, finding his father and determining what to do with him. This engagement, will he kill his father the way that he was charged to do? Will he join with his father? His father summoned him to do that. Will his father replace him? What will take place? So he meets his father, and his father, at first, there's a discourse where he sort of recaps how a Dunyain takes control. He says, as Dunyain, you had no choice to command yourself. You had to master circumstance. To master circumstance, you had to bind the actions of the world born to your will. You had to make limbs of nations, so you made their beliefs the object of your relentless scrutiny. It was axiomatic. Now that's interesting. He's saying, listen, you're one of the conditioned, and we're all trying to be self-moved movers, but really you couldn't have done anything different than what you did. He goes on and he has a whole bunch of things about, using the nations, their lies, their stories, all of those things. You understood that beliefs like men possessed hierarchies, that some commanded better than others, that religious belief commanded most of all. What better demonstration could there be than the Holy War itself? So you read their scriptures, scrutinized the authority of words over men. You saw the primary function of Inithrism to anchor belief in what cannot be seen. He goes on, the God who becomes the warrant of men in their station, and the arbitrary relations of power that are the truth of the emperor and the slave are covered over. And then he says, and here you saw the shortest path. You understood that this trick, which turns the eyes of the oppressed skyward and away from the hand that holds the whip, could be usurped to your ends. To command circumstance, you must command action. To command action, you must command belief. To command belief, you need only speak with the voice of heaven. You were Dunyain, one of the condition, and they with these stunted intellects were no more than children. So he says, the path was very narrow, but was very clear. You cultivated their awe and their inklings, telling them things no man could know. You appealed to the spark of logos within them. You mapped the logic of their commitments, showed them the implications of the tenets they already held. You showed them beliefs fixed by truth rather than function. You made their fears and weaknesses plain. You showed them who they were, even as you exploited these weaknesses to your advantage. You gave them purpose, though the world is anarchy. And throughout you insisted you were only a man like any other. You conditioned. So the Dunyain, Calhus, conditions these men. And Mangus knows it because he's been doing this his entire life on the outside as well. And he says, even this wasn't enough. Those without authority lost nothing by inserting you between them and their gods. Servitude is the most instinctive of habits, but those with authority, sooner or later the caste nobility had to move against you. Crisis was inevitable. This, he says, was where the probability trance failed me. And then Calhus introduces something new into the mix. He says, so you did not anticipate the visions? His father's face remained absolute and impassive. What visions? And as it turns out, Calhus is going to have brought something new to the mix that his father can't grasp, can't assimilate, and has to treat as madness. Calhus says, the God, he doesn't speak to you? No. Curious. Mangus says, and from where does his voice hail? From what darkness? Calhus says, I know not. Thoughts come, I only know that they're not mine. Another infinitesimal pause. He dips in the probability trance, the same as I. Mangus, the mad say much the same. Perhaps your trials have deranged you. Perhaps. It's not in your interest to deceive me. Then Calhus says, unless I've come to assassinate you, as our Dunyain brothers have decreed. Is this your apprehension? And he says, you have not the power to overcome me. But I do, Father. How? His father finally said. How could you know this? Because I know why you were compelled to summon me. So you've grasped it? Yes, the thousandfold thought. The thing that the whole story is supposed to be about, right? We're going to come back to this thousandfold thought in a moment, but first, we need to talk about this possible madness. And a little bit later, this voice you hear, the old Dunyain said, is not part of the thousandfold thought. Calhus ignored these words. Take me to them. To whom? To those you hold captive. And he's going to take him to see some of the skin spies that his father has been working upon. We'll come back to that part of the story in just a bit, because it's really important to get to this part about the god. So the god winds up being something outside of the scope of the Dunyain, just as much as earlier they had thought there wasn't sorcery. We see that both Calhus and his father encounter sorcery, master sorcery, take use of it. But Mangus has made some miscalculations. He, in becoming a Cisarum, doesn't realize that taking up the water isn't going to work for somebody like that. So here's what Calhus tells him. You assume taking up the water would be no different, that becoming one of the Indara Kishari would make you godlike in comparison, and since the Cisarum themselves scarcely understood the metaphysics of their practice, there was nothing you could learn that would contradict this assumption. You couldn't know that the psyche was a metaphysic of the heart, not the intellect, of passion. So you let them blind you only to find your powers proportional to your vestigial passion, something where the Dunyain actually are deficient. What you thought to be the shortest path was, in fact, a dead end. A dead end that will still allow him to fight against the consults, but not effectively. Going on, he says, about 12 years ago, you discovered the first of the consult skin spies, probably through discrepancies in their voices. The Cisarum were thrown into an uproar, and then you were Dunyain. Though our brothers know nothing of the arcane, our understanding of the mundane is without peer. You realized these things weren't sorcerous artifacts, that they were engines of the flesh, but you couldn't convince the other Cisarum, so that starts the war between the Cisarum and the Scarlet Spires. But you kept the creatures, and over years of torment you broke them down. You learned of Golgotharoth, her ramparts heaped around the horns of an ancient derelict, a vessel fallen from the void in the days when the non-men yet ruled Earwa, of the Inkuroi and the great war they waged against long-dead non-men kings. You learned how the last survivors of that fell race, Aurong and Aurochs, perverted the heart of their non-man captor, McCaffrey, and how he corrupted the Grand Master of the Mangagea in his turn. He goes on, you learned of the consult. Right? And he says, of course you heard of the consult, and you thought them long dead. But the stories you extracted had too much detail. There was too much consistency. The deeper you probed, the more troubling the story became. You learned that the boundaries between the world and the outside were not fixed. If the world could be cleansed of enough souls, it could be sealed shut against the gods, against the heavens and hells of the afterlife, against redemption, and most importantly, against the possibility of damnation. The consult, you realize, were laboring to save their souls. So he goes on and they talk about the second apocalypse, the probability trance, and the thousandfold thought once again. So the question then is Calhus insane the way his father thinks that he is? I mean, the Dunyain have effectively developed a psychology and philosophy that's beyond what we ourselves, even if we're working all of our time and thinking the most dialectically ways we can, beyond what we have achieved ourselves. I mean, it's work of fiction, so it's easy to do that. Or is it that the Dunyain and their conditioning, the probability trance, the thousandfold thought, all of these are, in some respect, preparatory for what Calhus is now becoming. Because it's not just visions, it's not just the God speaking to him, it's also the no-God speaking to him, as we find in his discourse with his father as well. And if we go further on, here we go. Only a true son of Ishmael could succeed. For all the thousandfold thoughts, innumerable deductions, its elegance, there remain countless variables that could not be foreseen. Each of its folds possesses a haze of catastrophic possibilities, most of them remote, others nearly certain. I would have abandoned it long ago were it not the consequences of inaction so absolute. Only one other condition could follow its path. Only you, my son. Calhus then says, you speak as if the thought were a living thing. And Mangus says, because it is. And here he brings in something interesting. Have you heard of a game played in southern Nilamesh, a game called Viramsata, or Many Breaths? He says, across the plains surrounding the city of Invishi, the ruling caste nobles are very remote, very effete. The narcotics they cultivate assure them of the obedience of their populations. Over the centuries, they've elaborated Nyan, this etiquette, to the point where it's eclipsed their old faiths. Entire lives are spent in what we might call gossip. But Virasmata is far different than the rumors of the court or the clucking of harem eunuchs. Far more. They have made games of truth. They tell lies about who said what to whom, about who makes love to whomever, and so on. They do this continually, and what is more, they are at pains to act out the lies told by others, especially when they are elegant, so they might make them true, and it goes from tongue to tongue until no distinction remains between what is a lie and what is true. In the end, a great ceremony is the most compelling tale that is declared Pir Virsut, a word that means this breath is ground in ancient Vaparsi. The weak, the inelegant have died while others go strong. Do you see the Virasmata? They become living things and we are their battle plane. Calhus nodded, like in Rhythism and Phonomery. Precisely. Lies that have conquered and reproduced over the centuries. Delusional worldviews that have divided the world between them. They are twin virismata that now war through shouts and limbs of men. And the thousandfold thought? Mangus turned to him, precisely as if he could see. An instigator that goads them, that bleeds them even as we speak. A formula of events that will rewrite the very course of history. A great transition rule that will see Inrithism and Phonomery transform. The thousandfold thought is all these things. So he says, and the truth, Calhus said, what of that? There is no truth for the world born. The Logos for them is a tool of their lust, nothing more. And Calhus goes on, and Mangus is saying, why, my son, why ask me what you already know? And so what is actually happening here? So if the thousandfold thought is something personified, something living, something with agency, and these other faiths, these other ways of looking at things are like that, but sort of facsimiles of it that can be taken over, then what should Calhus do? He should give himself over to the thousandfold thought, right? Now, there's a very important thing that happens here. Here we go, and this is a little bit later in their discussion. Calhus says, on the plains of Mengeda, the Chiral Nights, what I prophesied came to pass. To the world born, these words would have sent a blank devoid of concern or occasion, but to a Dunyain, let him think I waver. A fortuitous correspondence of cause, Mangus replied, nothing more. That which comes before yet determines that which comes after. How else could you have achieved all that you have achieved? How else could you be possible? So this is the, regular Dunyain approach to things. He was right. Prophecy could not be. But this is something that Calhus already figured out and worked through in the earlier volumes, right? If the ends of things govern their beginnings, if what came after determined what came before, how could he have mastered the souls of so many? How could the thousandfold thought come to rule the three seas? The principle of before and after simply had to be true if its presumption could so empower. His father had to be right. So what was this certainty, this immovable conviction that he was wrong, that his father was wrong? And he asked himself, am I mad? Mangus continues, the Dunyain think the world closed, that the mundane is all there is, and in this they are most certainly wrong. The world is open and our souls stand astride its bounds. But what lies outside is no more than a fractured and distorted reflection of what lies within. I have searched for nearly the length of your entire life. I have found nothing that contradicts the principle. He says, the God sleeps. It has been ever thus. Only by striving for the absolute may we awaken him, meaning, purpose. These words name not something given, they name our task. Set aside your conviction, Mangus said, for the feeling of certainty is no more a marker of truth than the feeling of will is a marker of freedom. Deceived men always think themselves certain, just as they always think themselves free. Calhus looked to the halos around his hands. But we, my son, do not have the luxury of error. Void has come to this world. He's talking about the Inikroi, right? And then the consult. It fell from the skies thousands of years past. And then Calhus says, yes, he speaks to me as well. The no God? Mangus asked. He paused momentarily. Had his father possessed eyes, Calhus was certain he would have seen them fall in and out of focus as consciousness within rose and submerged. Then you truly are mad. And what are the possibilities? Either he must be mad, or he must have seen something more. Mangus says the trial broke you. You confuse the madness within you for the darkness without, the same as the world born. He's asking his father, what is the no God? And his father won't answer. The darkness comes before you, Calhus, it owns you. You're one of the conditions. Surely you, And then he sees that there's others that are coming. He says, I have been chosen, Father. I am the harbinger. His father, Calhus realized, had finally grasped the principles of the encounter that they would be doing. Mangus had assumed his son would be the one requiring instruction. He had not foreseen it as possible, let alone inevitable, that the thousandfold thought, here's the key thing, right? Here's the resolution, would outgrow the soul of its incubation and discard it. So, what does that mean? Calhus is the thousandfold thought. He dominates it. He takes it. And he doesn't need his father at this point. His father and the Dunyain could need him, right? He says, when you learn of the damnation that awaits you, when you come to believe, you'll be no different than the Inkaroi. As a Dunyain, you'll be compelled to master the consequences of your wickedness. Like the consult, you'll come to see tyranny and what is holy, and you will war as they war. And so he says, for the Dunyain, it was axiomatic, right? They have to be closing things off. And he says, perhaps his father had yet to apprehend this. Perhaps he couldn't see past the arrival of his son. Or perhaps all this, the accusation of madness, was simply a ruse. Either way, it was irrelevant. You are Dunyain still, Father, as are, and then here's the key, the end. I am more, the warrior prophet said. I am more. I am all of that, all of the conditioning, all of those things, and I also have a grasp on sorcery, on prophecy, on a different permutation of the thousandfold thought. That is what is going to allow Calhus, among these other things like possessing the gnosis, to become the aspect emperor. In the thousandfold thought, we get to learn quite a bit more about both the Inkaroi and the unholy consult. In fact, we find out that one of the original members of the consult is behind the synthess, that is doing all sorts of stuff and engaging particularly with Canair. A lot of the revelations are taking place through the engagements of these consult agents, or agencies, we could say, with the main characters. And Canair is probably one of the most important ones, but as we're going to see, Calhus is as well. So one of the passages I want to focus on is when Canair is spending time with the skin spies, one of whom has taken the guise and really in many respects, I guess you could say personality in certain ways, of his former lover and prize, Serway. So he says, occasionally Canair spoke to them, learned something of their lean ways. They called themselves the last children of the Inkaroi, though they were loath to speak of their old fathers. They claimed to be keepers of the inverse fire, though the merest question regarding either their keeping or their fire pitched them into confusion. They never complained, save to say that they hungered for unspeakable congress, or to insist that they were falling, always falling. That's never really followed up, but it's an interesting thing to say. They declared he could trust them because their old father had made them his slaves. They were, he said, dogs that would sooner starve than snap meat from a stranger's hand. They carried, Canair could see, the spark of the void within them, like the Srank. So the Srank, and the Bashrag, and I guess you could even say the dragons, they all carry this sort of voidness within them, and the skin spies seem to as well. There's a really great explanation that's given here. As a child, Canair had been fascinated by trees. He saw them only in the winter months when they moved their camp into the Swaret, the highlands that bounded the sea, the Inrithi called Joria. Sometimes he would stare at the bare trees for so long they would lose their radial dimensions and seem something flat, like blood smeared into the wrinkles around an old woman's eyes. Men were like this, Canair realized, binding their manifold roots, then branching in 1,000 different directions, twinning into the greater canopy of other men. So, there we're talking about causality, about how we're all connected, our motivations, what binds us together. And then he says, But these things, these skin spies, were something altogether different. Although they could mimic men well enough, they did not bleed into their surroundings as men did. They struck through circumstances rather than reaching out to claim them. They were spears concealed in the thickets of human activities, thorns, tusks. And this lent them a curious beauty, a dread elegance. They were simple in the ways of knives, these skin spies. He envied them that, even as he loved and pitied. And he goes on again, and, he's a little bit later, he's going to talk about human beings having been told by this sorcerer that human beings are sort of like pinpricks in a map. And the skin spies, they're not like that. Their world is essentially a sealed one. Now later on, quite towards the end, where Mythonet becomes a bit player character, Mythonet, we realize, is actually the half-brother of Calhus because he was fathered by Mangus on his trip down to Chimay. We find out that one of the sorcerers belonging to the mandate itself has been a skin spy. Mythonet seizes him in this conference between Mythonet and the Shirrell Knights and the mandate sorcerers, the quorum. Simmias had gone limp as a kitten. The Shirra held him with impossible strength. And then Mythonet says, if you pinch them here, they're thoroughly incapacitated. Now Zara says, what is this madness, right? And Mythonet says, and if you wait, their true aspect will be revealed. The old sorcerer struggled for his breath. There was something about the way Simmias shook, something not old, something. And then Nautzera says, silence. Mythonet says, we learned of this one through our interrogations of the others. It's an accident, an anomaly that thankfully its architects have been unable to recreate. And then Nautzera says, what are you saying? Thrashing slack limbs, the thing called Simmias began howling in 100 lunatic voices. Mythonet braced his feet, rocked like a fisherman holding a twisting shark. Nautzera stumbled back, his hands raised and warding. With abject horror, he watched the man's oh-so-familiar face crack open, clutch at the spies with hooked digits. A skin spy with the ability to work sorcery, the Shira of the Thousand Temples said. A skin spy with a soul. So, even with these creations of the techne that the consult have been doing, there's variations, there's possibilities, there's differences, and this is quite an interesting one. It doesn't get followed up because it is an anomaly. Now, I'd mentioned that a lot of the engagements were with Canair, and this happens because the skin spies are being directed by this Synthes, and there are some very important conversations that are happening between Canair and the consult through this Synthes. So he talks about hearing the, the sound of beating wings. He saw a raven descending in the dark. To the right of the skin spy, one corpse lay askew, a heap of others, its elbows bent out backwards, its face turned towards Canair. The bird landed on its gray cheek. It regarded him with a white human face no larger than an apple. Canair cursed, stumbled backward. What new outrage was this? Old, the tiny face said in a reedy voice. Old is the covenant between our peoples. Canair said, I belong to no people. And then the Synthes says, perhaps, but something binds you to him. You would not have saved him otherwise. You would have not have killed my child. Canair says, nothing binds me. And then the bird says, but the past binds us all, Skilvendi, as the bow binds the flight of an arrow. All of us have been knocked, raised, and released. All that remains is to see where we land, whether we strike true. And what is he saying there? So the Skilvendi among the races of men were the ones who sided with the consult and the no-god and actually worshipped the no-god and have been fighting against other men since. They are the people of war, but now they have been largely destroyed. And the consult is trying to bring him in. And the consult is also saying, listen, we don't actually have a choice about what we're doing. They're saying something kind of similar to what Canair has realized about Calhus, right? So he goes on and he says, he came to you, didn't he? The father of the warrior prophet, the Dunyain. And he says, the hunt is over. Tomorrow the Holy War marches for Shirash and Amoteo. I am to remain behind. And then the Synthess says to him, you've been moved, nothing more. In Benjuka, every move bespeaks a new rule. We are that new rule, Skilvendi. Not even the dead escape the plate. So a little bit later in the text, there's another great conversation between these two. Again, the bird comes down and says, you perplex me, Skilvendi. Canair says, demons, Canair now knew, had many guises. They were everywhere, mauling the world with their anarchic appetites, outraging with their impersonations, birds, lovers, slaves, and most of all, him. He knows himself to also be, in some respects, a demon. The bird tells him, kill the Akure and the dogs will be loosed. Why do you stay your hand? Kill Confus. Do your task. And Canair says, you speak to me of killing when the Dunyain's death should be your only concern. And here we see that the consult have misled themselves. He says, the Akure plots the Holy War's destruction. We need the Dunyain to find the other, Mangus. He's the greater threat. And then Canair calls him a fool, and the bird says, I eclipse you, mortal. I am a son of a more violent race. You cannot conceive of the compass of my life. And Canair says, why? The blood that pulses through my veins is no less ancient, nor are the movements of my soul. You are not so old as the truth. And then Canair goes on and says, you still do not understand them. Before all, the Dunyain are intellect. I do not know their ends, but I know this. They make instruments of all things, and they do so with a way beyond the ken of me or even you, demon. And so the bird says, you think I underestimate them? And Canair says, it's inevitable. We are little more than children to them. Think on it, bird. Mangus has dwelt among the Chianine for 30 years. I know not your power, but I do know this. He lies far beyond it. And he says, as you say, Skilvendi, you know not my power. So, the consult is very powerful. It's been hiding for a long time. It's got all these resources at its disposal. And Canair says to them, do you know what a Dunyain would hear in your words? Posturing, vanity, weaknesses that betray your measure and offer innumerable lines of assault. A Dunyain would grant your declarations. He would encourage you in your confidence. In all things, he would dispense flattering appearances. He would care nothing whether you thought him your lesser, your slave, so long as you remained ignorant. And the bird says, ignorant of what? Canair spat, your true circumstances. And what are the true circumstances? He says that you're being played. You flounder in nets of your own making. The circumstances you struggle to master, bird, have long ago mastered you. Of course, you think otherwise. Like men, power stands high among your native desires, but you're a tool as much as any man of the tusk. And then the bird says, how then am I to become my own instrument? Canair snorted. For centuries, you've manipulated events from the dark, so you claim. Now you assume that you must do the same, that nothing has changed. I assure you, everything has changed. You think yourself hidden, but you're not. Chances are he already knows you've approached me. Chances are he already knows your ends and your resources. Even the ancient things, Canair realized, would suffer the Holy War's fate. The Dunyain would strip them the way the people strip the carcasses of bison, flesh for sustenance, fat for soap and fuel, bone for implements, hide for shelter and shield. No matter how deep they ran, the ages themselves would be consumed. The Dunyain was something new, perpetually new, like lust or hunger. And so he tells the Inquiry in this Synthess, you must abandon your old ways, bird. You must strike across trackless ground. You must surrender brute circumstance to him because you cannot hope to match him. You must watch. You must become a student of opportunity to kill him while you can. And the bird says, he's working our will. He's leading the Holy War to Shimei. And Canair calls him a fool, and then the bird says, do you not know who I am? And, shows him with this kind of glamour, and Canair holds his trinket, his korai, and says, sorcery, you're going to toss shanks to the wolves of my argument. Even as we speak, he learns sorcery. He's actually learning the mandate, the most powerful of the sorceries available, the gnosis. And here's where we see the underestimation going on. He says, it will take him years to learn. That's what that ultimately Aurang thinks. And Canair says, you forget, bird, he learned my people's tongue in 4 days. If he can learn a language, he can learn sorcery. And as we're going to see, under Achamian's tutelage and because of his native ability, Kelhus is actually able to take the mandate and its gnosis further than any of the humans ever did, taking it beyond perhaps even what some of the non-men who taught the gnosis, who are totally stained through and through with sorcery, did. A little bit later on, we actually get a point of view chapter, a subchapter, with the Synthess, and we find out it's who? Not just one of the old names, one of the oldest of the old names, one of the most important of those who fought against the non-men, against men, who's been directing things, part of the mandate all that time. He says, here we go. There had been a time when he'd walked in glory and honor, spear-bearer to mighty Sil, the great king after the fall. He'd dared the wrath of Kujara Kinmoy on the plains of Pir Pahal. He'd ridden the back of Wirrit, father of dragons. Right? He goes on. He was called the Angel of Deceit, and later called the Warlord, Aurang. Right? So he says, how had it come to this, bound to a Synthess like a king to a leper's robe, frail and fugitive, skulking about the fires of a roused enemy? There had come a time when the screams of thousands had heralded his coming. And he goes on and talks about being older than all of these things that are going on. And then he also reveals why they want to use the Holy War. For decades, the consult had assumed the alien metaphysics of the Cisarum had been responsible for uncovering their children in Shimei. This had made the prospect of the Empire's fall to the Phanim intolerable. The Holy War seemed a rare opportunity, but the plate, the Benjuka plate, where they play this game, had changed all too quickly. To realize that the Cisarum were but a mask for a far more ancient foe, to come so very close, only to discover their sublime deception subverted by something deeper, something new, the Dunyain. There was more to this than a son hunting for his father. Their devious methods and disconcerting abilities aside, these Dunyain were Anasurimbor. Even without the mandate prophecies, enmity was a fact of their accursed blood. So he goes on and says, the Skilvendi had been right about one thing. The Dunyain had seized too much already. They could not be allowed the Gnosis as well. Aurang tells them to prepare the place, and he says, the Anasurimbor marches the Heroic way. He will pause before crossing the plain, revise his plans. The Skilvendi is right. He's come to realize that they need to change their tactics. He isn't like the others. A normal man, even in Anasurimbor, would succumb to the eagerness that so quickened the legs of those who set upon a hard-won destination, but not a Dunyain. So he talks about, here we go, before the coming of these Dunyain, the consul could trust to their tools. Now, Orang had no choice but to intervene, to tyrannize what the tools could only mock, to possess what they could only mimic. He says, trust me, children, he'll be caught unawares when we strike. There is treachery in his wife's heart. They would test the limits of this prophet's penetration. They would try to deny him the gnosis. They don't succeed, of course. But there is a passage here where the Synthess now comes in the guise of Esamet. And I'm going to just skip through this fairly quickly without going into all the, descriptions of sexuality here. The consult had come, right? And he says, did you think Achamian's stories could prepare you? What the mandate dream is but a sliver of what I've lived, what I've seen. I've walked in the no-God shadow. I've looked across the void and blotted your world by holding a fingertip before it. No, you know nothing of me or my kind. And then Kelhus says, so what are you then, Kelhus? What are the Inkaroi? We are a race of lovers. The expected answer. Recollections cycled through his soul, not explicit and singular, but implicit and innumerable. Everything Acamion had said regarding these abominations. He slackened his face in the simulacrum of profound sorrow, and for this you are damned. She says, we are born for damnation's sake. Our very nature is our transgression. Look at this exquisite body. I climb and enter because I must. And for this I am to heave and scream in lakes of fire because of boundaries of skin. And then Calhus says, denial is the way. Boundaries are written into the order of things. And then she says, but you could rewrite the scripture of my doom, prophet? He said, and then he says, there is no absolution for your kind. So, and then, would you destroy the world? And she says, to save my soul, so long as there are men, there are crimes. So long as there are crimes, I am damned. Tell me, Dunyain, what track would you follow? What would you do to save your soul? And then she says, love is the way, and these little demons you call gods decree otherwise, dole out their rewards in proportion to our suffering. No, I would save my soul. And she tells him that his wife Asimov doesn't truly love him. She only worships, right? So she's trying to essentially seduce him. And he ends up pushing her away and engaging in one of the wards, one of the first that Acamion had taught him, right? And he says, across the world in Golgotharoth, the man Mangakea squat about your true flesh, rocking to the mutter of endless cants. This synthese, the thing that you're showing me right here, is but a node. You are no more than the reflection of a shadow, an image cast upon the water of Asimov. You possess subtlety, yes, but you haven't the depth to confront me. And what do we see here? Calhus is beyond where the consult is trying to seek him. They're not really able to make sense out of what he is. And that's probably the theme that we could return to, although we've already talked about this quite a lot in the other works. So I'm going to very quickly run through this, and then we'll talk about our last philosophical theme so I can be respectful of time. Both Canair and Acamion come to realize what the Dunyain is and what Calhus is. Not just in terms of his powers and properties, not just in terms of the capacities that being one of the conditioned affords him, but the fact that they really are like children to him being an adult, and that he does not love. He may feel value, he may feel all sorts of things, but deep down inside, he does not love. He sees a greater plan, but love is only a tool within it. And we see that Acamion echoes what Canair points out and what the consult, in a certain sense, grasps, but in a twisted way. Canair says, they make us love. That's the greatest power of the Dunyain, is the capacity to bring people in. Even Asimov, even Acamion. And Acamion thinks that he's somewhat immune because he's a critic, he's standoffish, he doesn't believe, he can see what's going on, but even his doubt, even his criticism, even his awe get drawn into him becoming, like it or not, a tool to the man, the godlike man, who in effect cuckolds him and takes from him the one thing besides the mandate that he's stuck with that he truly loves, which is Asimov. And the last thing that we should talk about as a theme is, in fact, the transformation that happens with Asimov. There is some very important exposition about the history, including that of the non-men and the Inkeroi and the consult, going on in this depiction of what happens once Asimov starts really studying texts under Calhus's, you could say, influence. He's the one who taught her how to read. She gets the books from Acamion, and all of these allow her to grow, to add something knew. Now, of course, she's a very remarkable character to begin with, but I want to highlight a few things here. So she's already been raised to power, and that itself is a very important difference. She says that woman, that Sunni harlot who hung her legs bare from her window, was a stranger to her. Now the trappings, let alone fact, of power would be enough to make the old Asimov weep for wonder, but it's the reading that changes it. She says, the old Asimov would never accept an understanding indistinguishable from trust. But what would strike the old Asimov the most, she had no doubt, would be the knowledge. In that one respect, she'd been extraordinary. Very few pondered their ignorance as she had. Their conceit compelled them to prize only what they knew beforehand, and since significance followed from the already known, they always thought they possessed everything relevant to any question of truth. She always understood that her world, for all its great immensity, was a sham. That is why she'd made her custom into apertures, windows onto the world's various corners. She'd used Akamion as a doorway to the past, and now Kelhus. And Kelhus, as she says, has written the world down to its very foundations. The old Asimov would be astounded, even outraged, but she would come to believe eventually. What we saw in earlier books is that Asimov, when she was illiterate, would use the men that she had sex with as ways, she's saying apertures here, ways to get to know more about the world, asking them lots of questions, piecing together something. And then, here we go, like the third analytic, the sagas were one of those works familiar even to illiterate caste menials such as herself. She found it strange recalling her impressions of such things before Akamion or Kelhus. The ancient North, she knew, it always seemed weighty and profound, a phrase with a palpable skin-prickling air, right? She knew of the no-God, the apocalypse, the ordeal, but they were little more than curiosities. The ancient North was a place, something she could point to. The times Akamion had mentioned the sagas, he did so only to dismiss or to disparage. For a mandate schoolman, he said they were like pearls strung across a corpse. He spoke of the apocalypse and the no-God the way that others described running arguments with their relatives. So, going on a little bit further down, she said, the sagas had come to seem something foolish, perhaps even criminal. As much as she'd learned about the apocalypse, the fact remained that she knew nothing about the sagas themselves, as works, as texts. The moment she gingerly unrolled the first section of scroll, that ignorance struck her with the curious force of undone deceptions. Despite the title, she was surprised to discover the sagas consisted of a number of different works written by different authors, though only 2 were named. There were 9 sagas in total. Some, she would later discover, were verse epics, while others were prose chronicles. She had no idea where Kelhus had obtained the scroll. It was, very nice. And then, going on a little bit further, she found the going both difficult and curiously erotic, as though, aside from the masturbatory solitude of reading, her struggle to accommodate the writer's ancient assumptions was something too intimate not to be carnal. Right? She gathered that the dynasty of Anasurimbor was old and venerable, even in those days of far antiquity. And now he talks about a transformation of perspective. She goes on, for some reason she'd always thought of the first apocalypse as the beginning of history rather than the end of one. And what's happening here is she's gaining greater and greater perspective. She says she realized that her understanding of the old wars was merely episodic. Now she's beginning to understand all of these things. And here we get the long exposition. And what is happening here with all of this? She is developing a greater knowledge by literacy, by reading, by engaging with those who had written in the past. I think this is a really fitting place to end, because we can say something, I think, analogous, not the same, but analogous to our own readings of these and of other texts as well. How much do we learn when we actually go and do the work of reading the originals and not simply relying on somebody else's regurgitation, interpretation, even worse, oversimplification and proof texting as the ways, as the maps for understanding our existence. We do so much better when we go to the originals and when we do the hard work and put in the time of reading. And that can happen with something that's even a set of works of fiction, a modern day epic of sorts. This is epic fantasy, after all, of great imaginative but also intellectual depth. So that is where we're going to conclude all of this discussion that's been going on now for 3 sessions, 3 straight months, of this great Prince of Nothing trilogy by R. Scott Bakker.